In the spring of 1945, as World War II drew toward its violent and chaotic conclusion, something extraordinary happened on the dusty roads of a collapsing Germany that would forever challenge everything a group of young women had ever been taught about the world, about race, about humanity itself. These were not hardened soldiers in the traditional sense, not warriors who had seen the brutality of frontline combat, but rather telephone operators, Red Cross nurses, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, and medical clerks who had been swept up in the chaotic and terrifying tide of Germany's final retreat. They had spent their entire lives, from childhood through young adulthood, immersed in a carefully constructed reality built brick by their regime, a reality filled with propaganda so pervasive, so deeply ingrained, and so constantly reinforced that questioning it had never even occurred to most of them. Among the countless lies they had been fed through radio broadcasts, newsreels, posters, and official teachings, perhaps none was more vicious or more deliberately dehumanizing than what they had been told about Black Allied soldiers. The propaganda machine had painted these men as something less than human, as savage threats to be feared above all else, as living proof of everything their twisted ideology claimed about racial hierarchy and superiority. But reality, as it so often does in the most unexpected moments, was about to collide head-on with years of carefully constructed indoctrination, and that collision would happen in the most surprising way possible, not through violence or confrontation or military force, but through the simplest and most powerful thing in the world, basic human kindness. As American forces pushed deeper and deeper into German territory during those final desperate months of the war, crossing the Rhine River and capturing town after town, village after village, they left behind a trail of abandoned military positions, empty hospitals, hastily evacuated communication posts, and makeshift headquarters that the retreating German forces had fled in absolute panic. Among those captured in this chaotic exodus, in this complete collapse of military order, were small numbers of women, both civilians and auxiliaries, who had served in various support roles far from any frontline combat zone. Most of these women, ranging in age from barely 18 to middle-aged veterans of the support services, had never encountered an American soldier before in their entire lives, and absolutely none of them had ever seen a Black American soldier in person. Everything they knew, or thought they knew, about these men came exclusively from years of relentless propaganda broadcasts that crackled through radios in every home, from caricatured images plastered on walls and printed in newspapers, and from stern warnings delivered by officials and teachers who spoke with absolute authority. Their entire worldview had been built on a foundation of racial ideology, so deeply embedded in every aspect of their education and daily life that it shaped every single assumption they held about who was superior, who was inferior, who was civilized, and who was supposedly dangerous. Now, sitting exhausted and confused in a makeshift holding area, uncertain about their fate and terrified about what might come next, they would have those beliefs tested in ways they could never have imagined in their darkest nightmares or wildest dreams. Picture this scene if you can really try to imagine it in vivid detail. In a makeshift holding area set up just outside the stone walls of a recently captured German town, its buildings still smoking from recent shelling, about 24 female detainees sat scattered on rough military blankets and wooden ammunition crates, their faces deeply marked by exhaustion, hunger, and the psychological shock of watching their entire world collapse around them. American guards, mostly young white soldiers from units that had fought their way across France and into Germany, kept professional watch over them with rifles slung across their shoulders and expressions that revealed nothing of what they might be thinking. The women whispered among themselves in small clusters, trying desperately to make sense of what would happen next, trading rumors and fears in hushed German voices, when suddenly a new rumor began to spread through the group like wildfire racing through dry grass. A convoy was coming, someone said with certainty, though no one knew quite where the information came from. Several trucks from a supply unit that would transport them to a proper processing camp somewhere behind the advancing American lines. Then came the detail that made several women visibly stiffen with immediate fear, that caused faces to go pale and hands to tremble. Someone whispered, her voice barely audible, that some of the soldiers in the approaching convoy were black soldiers, African American troops. The reaction was immediate and visceral and deeply revealing of just how effective the propaganda had been. Some women froze completely where they sat, their bodies going rigid with fear, while others exchanged looks of genuine terror with their companions, and a few began muttering under their breath the same dark warnings that had been drilled into them by their instructors and by endless propaganda films they had been forced to watch over the years. One woman, barely 20 years old with blonde hair and tired blue eyes, whispered to her companion with a voice that trembled with genuine fear that they had been told these soldiers would hurt women, that they were dangerous and violent and could not be trusted. Another woman, slightly older and wearing the torn uniform of a telephone operator, shook her head slowly in confusion, asking aloud if such terrible things could possibly be true, her voice betraying both lingering doubt and deep-seated fear that had been planted years ago and watered daily with official lies. The awful truth was that they simply did not know what to believe anymore. How could they possibly know what was real and what was fiction? Their entire understanding of the world beyond Germany's borders, every single thing they thought they knew about other races and other nations, had been carefully filtered and deliberately distorted by one totalitarian regime that controlled every single piece of information they received from the moment they woke up until the moment they went to sleep. And now reality itself was rolling toward them on the rubber wheels of 2 American military trucks. And that reality was about to shatter everything they thought they understood. The sound reached them first, cutting through the tense silence that had fallen over the group, the distinctive rumble of approaching diesel engines echoing down the dusty country road. Then the vehicles themselves appeared around a bend in the road, emerging from behind a damaged farmhouse, 2 olive-green American trucks kicking up clouds of pale dust as they rolled toward the holding area. The trucks came to a gradual stop about 20 yards from where the women sat, their engines idling for a moment before falling silent, and in that sudden quiet the settling dust seemed to hang suspended in the afternoon air. Both vehicles belonged to a segregated quartermaster company, one of the many all-black units that handled supplies and logistics for the American Army despite facing discrimination and segregation within their own military. The back tailgates of both trucks dropped open with metallic clangs that made some of the German women flinch, and then the American soldiers began hopping down onto the ground, stretching their tired muscles after long hours cramped in the truck beds, laughing and joking with each other in English that the German women could not understand, complaining good-naturedly about the terrible quality of their standard-issue rations and about the endless miles they had covered that day on rough European roads. The soldiers were completely and utterly unaware of the intense psychological tension their simple arrival had created just a few yards away, unaware that the women watching them had been taught through years of systematic propaganda to expect monsters, to see devils, to anticipate violence. But what the German women actually saw before them, what their own eyes showed them despite what their indoctrination told them to see, were not monsters at all. They were just men, regular young men, some barely out of their teenage years, others in their 20s, all of them tired from long hours of demanding work on the road, making exactly the same kinds of jokes that soldiers everywhere have always made about whose boots were in worse condition and whose sergeant yelled the loudest and who got stuck with the worst assignments. They were utterly and completely normal human beings, and that simple, undeniable reality contradicted every single thing the women had been told, every warning they had received, every caricature they had seen. The propaganda had prepared them mentally and emotionally for something violent, something cruel, something inhuman and monstrous. Instead, they saw regular soldiers who looked like they just wanted to finish their assignment for the day and maybe get some halfway decent food if they were lucky. But the truly shocking moment, the precise instant that would stay burned into these women's memories for the rest of their lives, the moment they would recall decades later with perfect clarity, came next. A black sergeant stepped forward from the group of soldiers, his uniform dusty from travel and marked with the stripes of his rank, and he looked directly at the assembled German women with an expression that held absolutely no malice, no threat, no anger, just calm professional demeanor, and perhaps even a hint of sympathy for their obvious exhaustion and fear. Then he spoke in clear, measured English, his voice neither harsh nor particularly gentle, just matter-of-fact and businesslike, and a German interpreter who worked for the Americans quickly translated his words into German that the women could understand. The sergeant told them simply and directly that the trucks were ready for transport, that there was no need whatsoever to be afraid, and that they would all be given proper food once they reached the processing camp. The women stared in absolute stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what they had just heard. Food, an assurance of safety, kindness in his tone. From soldiers they had been systematically conditioned to fear as the most dangerous threat imaginable. One older auxiliary, a woman in her 40s who had worked in military communications, muttered under her breath just loud enough for those near her to hear, asking in genuine confusion why he was being so polite to them, as if politeness itself from such a source was somehow deeply suspicious or must be hiding some darker motive. Another woman said quietly, almost to herself as if afraid to speak the thought aloud, that this simply could not possibly be real, that something must be wrong, that this contradicted everything. But it was real as the dust on the road and the warm spring sunshine, and the surprises were far from over. As the American soldiers began the practical work of organizing the women for transport, helping them gather up their few remaining belongings and prepare to board the trucks, one particular moment crystallized and concentrated everything into a single unforgettable image. One German woman, thin and exhausted, struggled visibly with a heavy canvas bag, quite possibly the very last possession she had managed to hold onto through all the chaos of retreat and capture and the collapse of everything she had known. A young black American private, probably no more than 22 or 23 years old, noticed her obvious difficulty and stepped forward without hesitation, saying simply and kindly in English, "Madam, let me help you with that." The woman jerked backward instinctively, as if she had been shocked by electricity, her reaction born entirely from years of propaganda telling her in no uncertain terms that such a man was dangerous, that he meant her harm, that she should be terrified. But the young soldier did not react with anger at her obvious fear, did not take offense at her instinctive recoil, did not respond with any kind of hostility whatsoever. He simply smiled at her, a genuine human smile that reached his eyes and showed only kindness and perhaps understanding. And then he bent down and picked up her heavy bag anyway without waiting for permission, lifting it with ease and placing it gently and carefully on the truck's metal tailgate as if it contained something precious. Then he did something that would change this woman's entire understanding of the world forever. He turned back to her and offered his hand to help her climb up onto the high truck bed. Exactly as any gentleman, might help any lady in need of assistance. She stood there completely frozen between two entirely different worlds. One world built carefully on lies and hatred and fear, and another world revealing itself right before her eyes as something totally different, as basic human decency and kindness. The moment stretched out and seemed to last far longer than the few seconds it actually took, time itself seeming to slow down as she stood there staring at his extended hand, her mind racing, her heart pounding, everything she had ever been taught warring against what her own eyes were showing her. Then, slowly and cautiously, with visible hesitation in every movement, she reached out her own hand and took his. In that single instant of simple human contact, palm touching palm, something fundamental and deep broke inside her. Not broke in fear or terror, but broke in sudden, overwhelming, crushing realization. A lifetime of carefully constructed indoctrination, years and years of systematic lies and propaganda, shattered completely in one simple gesture of basic humanity. Years later, looking back on that spring day in 1945 from the distance of age and experience and a completely transformed understanding of the world, she would remember that precise moment as the very first time she truly understood just how deeply, how completely, and how deliberately she had been lied to about almost everything. The journey to the processing camp revealed even more to these women and continued the process of transformation that had begun with that first shocking encounter. As the military truck rumbled along the damaged road, its suspension bouncing over rough patches and potholes left by recent combat, its wheels kicking up trails of dust behind them, the Black American soldiers talked among themselves about all the ordinary things that soldiers always talk about when they are tired and far from home. They spoke with animated gestures about their homes and families back in America, about the unbearable European heat that they were not used to, about baseball games and scores they had missed while overseas, about the kinds of food they desperately wished they could eat instead of the monotonous military rations they were stuck with day after day. Their conversations were not harsh or threatening in any way, contained no menace or cruelty, no dark undertones whatsoever. They did not speak about the German women at all except in the most practical terms related to the logistics of their transport, where they needed to stop, how long the journey would take, completely routine military business. They simply existed as regular human beings doing an assigned job, and that profound ordinariness, that absolute normalcy, was perhaps the most revolutionary and world-shattering thing the German women could possibly witness in that moment. The detainees exchanged nervous glances with each other at first, uncertain looks filled with confusion and the beginning of doubt about everything they had been taught. And then gradually those glances evolved into something closer to genuine curiosity, a desire to understand how everything they had been told could be so completely wrong. And finally their expressions shifted into something that actually resembled respect for these men who were treating them with such unexpected dignity. One woman finally found the courage to lean close to her companion and whisper so the soldiers would not hear, saying that these men were treating them far better, far more humanely, than she had ever expected or thought possible. Another woman nodded slowly in agreement, her eyes still watching the soldiers, and said quietly, as if afraid to admit it even to herself, that this was absolutely not what they had been told, not at all what the propaganda had promised. Everything was different from what she had been taught to believe. The rest of the journey continued in a kind of deep reflective silence as history itself was being fundamentally rewritten inside each woman's mind, as a lifetime of systematic lies began to crumble under the simple weight of observed reality and basic human decency. When the trucks finally rolled to a stop and arrived at the temporary holding camp, a collection of tents and temporary structures set up to process prisoners and detainees, The women were given rough wool blankets to ward off the chill of the evening that was beginning to fall, clean water to drink from American canteen cups, and what was for many of them the first real, proper meal they had eaten in days or even weeks. The Black American soldiers efficiently unloaded their equipment and supplies with the practiced movements of men who had done this same routine hundreds of times before. Tired men who wanted to complete their current assignment and move on to whatever duty awaited them next in the endless cycle of military logistics. There was absolutely no cruelty in any of their actions, no harassment of any kind, no deliberate humiliation or abuse of their position of power. Just standard military procedure carried out professionally and basic human decency extended to people who had been their enemies just days before. The German women watched the soldiers prepare to leave, some still struggling internally to reconcile what they had directly experienced with their own eyes and ears with what they had been taught and told to believe their entire lives, while others were beginning to feel the first uncomfortable stirrings of shame and guilt. One nurse, interviewed many years after the war had ended and she had built an entirely new life, confessed with visible emotion that these Black American soldiers had treated her and her companions with more dignity, more basic human respect, than they had any right whatsoever to expect given what their nation had done and what they had been taught to believe. And that simple realization, she said, more than any political speech or propaganda pamphlet or allied radio broadcast could ever have accomplished, was what finally and completely destroyed the last stubborn remnants of the poisonous ideology that had been so carefully implanted in her mind from childhood. It was not force that changed her, not lectures about morality or freedom or democracy. It was simple, undeniable, witnessed kindness extended by the very people the propaganda machine had taught her to look down upon, to fear, to see as less than human. That encounter on a dusty road in the spring of 1945 became a genuine turning point for many of these detained women, a moment that divided their lives into before and after, a moment when they realized with shocking clarity that the world outside Germany was not the monstrous caricature they had been raised from birth to believe in. The profound and painful irony of the situation was not lost on history or on anyone who studies this remarkable moment. These Black American soldiers, despite serving in a segregated army that reflected the racial prejudices of their own country, despite facing terrible discrimination and injustice at home in America, despite being treated as second-class citizens in the very nation they were fighting to defend, chose nonetheless to extend dignity and basic human kindness to people who had been raised in a system specifically designed to teach them to hate. History rarely gives us scenes so painfully ironic and yet so deeply, fundamentally, beautifully human. Sometimes the most powerful way to dismantle a massive lie, to destroy years of propaganda, is not through logical argument or military force or political speeches, but simply to stand there as living, breathing proof that the lie is not true, to act with such undeniable humanity that the lie becomes impossible to maintain. This is a true story from World War II, preserved in interviews and military records and personal testimonies, a reminder that sometimes a single human interaction, one unexpected moment of basic kindness between supposed enemies, can accomplish what years of propaganda and indoctrination tried so desperately hard to prevent. It can open eyes that were deliberately kept shut, change hearts that were taught to hate, and shatter the thick walls that prejudice and fear build between human beings. The women who experienced this transformative moment carried it with them for the rest of their lives, and in doing so, they became living witnesses to a simple but extraordinarily powerful truth that transcends nations and wars and ideologies, the truth that humanity, when given even the smallest chance, can break through even the most carefully constructed and viciously maintained walls of prejudice and fear, and teach us that we are all, in the end, just human beings trying to make our way through an often difficult world.